John Mercer sat at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in May, drinking his coffee and looking at the calendar on the wall. It was just another day. He would put on his blue uniform, clip on his badge, and drive to the Oakland Police Department where he had worked for 15 years. But today the phone rang and changed everything. "Officer Mercer, this is Captain Richard speaking. We need you for a special assignment next week." John straightened in his chair. Special assignments usually meant overtime pay, which he and Susan could use for their summer vacation plans. "Yes, sir. What's the assignment?" John asked, grabbing a pen to take notes. "General Alan Peterson died yesterday. Heart attack. The funeral is scheduled for next Saturday at Oakland National Cemetery. We need our best officers for security detail." John wrote down the details while feeling a mix of pride and pressure. Being chosen for this assignment meant the department trusted him. General Peterson had been a big deal in Oakland after retiring here, a 4-star general with friends in high places. "I'll be there, sir." "Thank you for the opportunity," John said, trying to sound confident despite the sudden knot in his stomach. After hanging up, John stared at his coffee, now getting cold. His hand trembled slightly. The tremors had started 6 months ago after the shooting at the convenience store where he had almost died. A robbery gone wrong. John had fired his weapon for the first time in his career, killing a 20-year-old kid who had pointed a gun at his partner. The department psychologist had cleared him for duty after 3 mandatory sessions, but John had lied during his evaluation. He hadn't told anyone about the nightmares, the cold sweats, or how he sometimes zoned out during normal conversations. "Who was that?" Susan asked as she walked into the kitchen tying her robe. Her hair was still messy from sleep. "Captain, I've been assigned to security for General Peterson's funeral next weekend." Susan smiled and squeezed his shoulder. "That's great, John. They always pick you for the important stuff." John forced a smile back. "Yeah, it's an honor." Later that day, John sat in his patrol car outside a local elementary school, watching children play during recess. His mind drifted to the funeral assignment. He should tell someone about his problems. The flashbacks, the way loud noises made him jump, how he sometimes saw the young robber's face when he closed his eyes. But telling the truth now might cost him this assignment, maybe even his job. With Katie starting college next year and Billy's braces, they needed every penny of his salary. "I can handle it," John whispered to himself. "Just one more big assignment, then maybe I'll talk to someone." That night, John couldn't sleep. He got out of bed carefully to avoid waking Susan and went to the living room. He opened his laptop and searched for information about General Peterson. The general had served for 40 years, fought in 3 wars, and advised 2 presidents. There would be high-ranking military officials at this funeral, maybe even the Secretary of Defense. As John scrolled through articles, he found himself reading about PTSD in police officers. One story described exactly what he was experiencing: the hypervigilance, the flashbacks, the emotional numbness. The article said that many officers hid their symptoms, fearing it would make them look weak or unreliable. John closed the laptop, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. He wasn't alone, but he also wasn't getting better by ignoring it. The week passed quickly. John attended 2 briefings about the funeral security plan. The team would include 24 officers positioned strategically around the cemetery. John's post would be near the podium where various military officials would give speeches. The night before the funeral, John barely slept. He took a long shower in the morning, hoping the hot water would calm his nerves. When he put on his dress uniform, Susan took a picture of him. "You look handsome," she said, straightening his tie. "Are you feeling okay? You look tired." "Just didn't sleep well," John replied. "Big responsibility today." Susan kissed him goodbye. "You'll do great. You always do." John arrived at the cemetery 2 hours early. The sky was overcast, threatening rain but never delivering. He checked in with Sergeant Miller, who gave him his final instructions. "You'll be standing here," Miller said, pointing to a spot about 15 feet from the podium. "Keep your eyes on the crowd. We're expecting about 400 people, including some pretty important folks. John nodded, his mouth dry. Any specific threats we should know about? Nothing specific, but with this many high-ranking officials in one place, we can't be too careful. As guests began to arrive, John took his position. He watched men and women in military uniforms with countless medals and ribbons. Some arrived in black government SUVs with tinted windows. John recognized the Secretary of Defense from news photos. The cemetery filled with people, all speaking in hushed voices. The ceremony began precisely at 11 a.m. A military band played, as General Peterson's flag-draped coffin was carried to the gravesite by 6 uniformed soldiers. John scanned the crowd continuously, looking for anything unusual. His heart rate had been elevated all morning, and he could feel sweat forming under his uniform despite the cool day. After the chaplain spoke, a tall man in a decorated uniform approached the podium. Sergeant Miller's voice came through John's earpiece. That's Brigadier General Howard Wells, Peterson's old friend. He's giving the main eulogy. John watched as General Wells adjusted the microphone. The general was about 60, with silver hair and perfect posture. He looked around at the crowd with a solemn expression, then reached inside his jacket pocket. In that moment, something in John's brain misfired. The movement, a hand going inside a jacket, triggered a flashback to the convenience store shooting. Suddenly, John wasn't seeing General Wells anymore. He was seeing the young robber reaching for his gun. Without conscious thought, John's hand moved to his service weapon. He drew it and pointed it directly at General Wells. There was a collective gasp from the crowd. John's vision tunneled, his ears ringing. He didn't hear the shouts, didn't process that he was aiming at an unarmed man at a funeral. Time seemed to slow down. In reality, only seconds passed before 2 military security personnel tackled John from behind. His gun was wrenched from his hand. He hit the ground hard, his cheek pressing into the grass as someone handcuffed him. "What the hell are you doing?" someone yelled in his ear. The fog cleared from John's mind. Horror washed over him as he realized what had happened. He saw General Wells being surrounded by protective officers. He saw the shocked faces in the crowd. He saw fellow police officers looking at him with disbelief. I thought he was pulling a weapon," John stammered. I wasn't. But no one was listening. John was pulled to his feet and marched quickly away from the ceremony, past the stunned onlookers. Some had their phones out, recording everything. By the time John was placed in the back of a police car, he knew his life had just fallen apart. As the car drove away, John caught a final glimpse of the funeral through the window. The ceremony was continuing, but nothing would ever be the same. Not for the attendees who had witnessed the shocking moment, not for the police department that would face difficult questions, and certainly not for John Mercer, who had spent 15 years building a career and a reputation that had just been destroyed in 10 seconds of confusion. The car turned a corner, and the cemetery disappeared from view. John leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes, not knowing that this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would lead him to prison, tear his family apart, and eventually spark a national conversation about police mental health, justice, and redemption. The holding cell was cold and smelled of bleach. John sat on the metal bench, still in his dress uniform, though his badge, belt, and tie had been taken away. 5 hours had passed since the incident at the funeral, 5 hours of sitting alone, with his thoughts, replaying those terrible seconds over and over. The door opened, and Captain Richard walked in with a stern face. He looked tired and angry. "You've really done it this time, Mercer," he said, staying by the door. "Do you have any idea what's happening out there? Your face is on every news channel in America. Cop pulls gun on general at military funeral. They're calling it an assassination attempt." John stood up quickly. "That's not what happened. I had a flashback. I thought he was reaching for a weapon." Captain Richard shook his head. "You had a flashback? Why is this the first I'm hearing about any problems? Your psych evaluation after the convenience store shooting cleared you completely. I wasn't honest in those sessions," John admitted, his voice low. "I didn't want to lose my job." "Well, now you've lost a lot more than that." The captain handed John a cell phone. "Your wife has been calling the station. You get 2 minutes." John's hands shook as he took the phone and dialed Susan. She answered on the first ring. "John? Oh my God, John, what's happening?" "There are reporters outside our house." Katie called from college crying because her roommate showed her a video of you on social media. "Susan, listen to me," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I made a terrible mistake. I had one of those episodes like after the shooting. It wasn't real. I need you to call Gary Newman." Gary was a lawyer friend who had helped them with their wills last year. "He's already on his way to the station," Susan said. "John, they're saying such awful things on TV. That you hate the military. That you planned this. None of that is true. You know that." John looked up at Captain Richard, who pointed at his watch. "I have to go now. Tell the kids I love them. Everything's going to be okay." Even as he said it, John knew it was a lie. Nothing would be okay for a very long time. After hanging up, John was taken to be formally charged. The district attorney had rushed to the police station personally, a sign of how big this case had already become. John was charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault on a military officer, and terrorism. The terrorism charge shocked him the most. "Terrorism?" John asked his lawyer later that evening in an interview room. "How can they possibly call this terrorism?" Gary Newman, a balding man in his 50s with kind eyes behind thick glasses, looked grim. "They're claiming you deliberately targeted a military leader to make a political statement. They've already pulled some old posts from your Facebook account." "What posts?" John asked, confused. "From 3 years ago. You shared some articles criticizing military spending and commented that the money would be better spent on schools and hospitals." John stared in disbelief. "That was about the federal budget. I wasn't attacking the military. My own father served in the Army for 20 years. Gary placed his hand on John's shoulder. "I know that, but they're building a narrative. The media is running with it, and the prosecutors want to make an example of you. Your bail hearing is tomorrow, but I have to prepare you. They're going to ask for no bail." John didn't sleep that night in his cell. The next morning, bleary-eyed and still in yesterday's rumpled uniform, he was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and leg chains. The room was packed with reporters and spectators. He spotted Susan in the front row, sitting with their son, Billy. Katie wasn't there, probably still at college. Judge Harriet Powell, known for her tough sentencing, looked down at John with cold eyes. The prosecutor, District Attorney Vincent Clark, argued passionately against bail. "Your Honor, the defendant committed a violent act against a decorated military leader in front of hundreds of witnesses. He is facing potential life imprisonment and is therefore a flight risk. Furthermore, the shocking nature of his actions suggests he is a danger to the community." Gary countered with evidence of John's ties to the community, his spotless record prior to this incident, and argued that the act was the result of an untreated mental health condition. Judge Powell was unmoved. "Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody until trial." As John was led away, he caught Susan's eye. She mouthed, "I love you," but her face was pale with fear. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings with Gary, psychological evaluations, and crushing isolation. John was kept in protective custody, separated from other inmates because he was a police officer. His cell was barely larger than a closet. He was allowed outside for 1 hour each day, alone in a small exercise yard with high concrete walls. The psychological evaluation confirmed what John already knew. He had severe PTSD from the convenience store shooting. Dr. Laura Winters, the independent psychiatrist hired by Gary, explained how PTSD could cause dissociative episodes and hypervigilance. "In that moment, Officer Mercer wasn't seeing General Wells," she wrote in her report. "He was reliving his traumatic experience, seeing a threat that wasn't actually present. But the prosecution had their own experts who claimed John's condition wasn't severe enough to explain his actions. They continued to push the narrative that the incident was politically motivated." Meanwhile, the media frenzy grew. Conservative networks portrayed John as an anti-military radical who had infiltrated the police force. Liberal networks used the case to highlight problems with police training and mental health support. Everyone had an opinion, and few were interested in the nuanced truth. Susan visited twice a week, bringing updates about their children and managing to stay strong despite the nightmare they were living. Billy, at 16, was being bullied at school. Katie had taken a leave of absence from college after a group of students protested her presence on campus. We had to change our phone number, Susan told John during one visit. The hate mail keeps coming. Someone threw a brick through our living room window last night. John felt sick with guilt. I've destroyed our lives, he whispered. Susan reached across the table and took his hand, ignoring the guard's warning look. No. This system is destroying our lives. Your department failed you. They should have recognized the signs, should have helped you. 3 months after the funeral incident, another blow came. Someone at the police department leaked John's personnel file to the media. It included private comments from colleagues, including one officer who had noted John seemed jumpy and distant in the weeks before the incident. Another claimed to have heard John criticize military spending at a holiday party. These out-of-context comments fueled the prosecution's narrative. The most damaging leak came from Officer Pete Daniels, who John had considered a friend. Pete told reporters that John had once said, "These military parades are just propaganda," while they were watching a Veterans Day celebration on TV in the break room. The comment, made years ago during a casual conversation, was now being used to prove John's anti-military sentiment. Gary was furious. These leaks are illegal, but they're destroying our chance at a fair trial. The jury pool is being poisoned. As summer turned to fall, John lost weight and developed dark circles under his eyes. Each day in confinement was a struggle against despair. The only bright spot came unexpectedly in October, when Gary arrived with surprising news. "General Wells has asked to meet with you," Gary said. "He's been following your case, and he has questions about your PTSD claim." John was stunned. "The man I pointed a gun at wants to meet me? Why would he do that?" "I don't know, but this could be important. He has influence. If he believes your side of the story, it could change everything." 2 days later, John sat in the prison meeting room waiting nervously. When General Howard Wells walked in, tall and commanding even in civilian clothes, John felt a rush of shame and fear. This was the man he had traumatized, the man whose life he had threatened. The general sat down across from John and studied him silently for a long moment. "Officer Mercer," he finally said, "I'd like to hear your story. Not what the newspapers are saying, not what the prosecutors claim. I want to hear from you what happened that day and why." John took a deep breath and began to speak, not knowing that this conversation would mark a turning point in his case, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. John sat across from General Wells, feeling like his future hung on this conversation. The prison meeting room was quiet except for the occasional sound of a guard walking past the door. John had just finished telling his story, the convenience store shooting, the nightmares that followed, his decision to hide his symptoms, and the terrible moment at the funeral when past and present collided in his mind. General Wells had listened without interrupting. His face gave away nothing. Now he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on John's. "Do you know how many soldiers I've seen with PTSD?" the general asked. His voice was deep and measured. "Hundreds. Some couldn't sleep. Some jumped at every loud noise. Some saw enemies in the faces of friends. I believe you, Officer Mercer." John felt a rush of relief so strong it made him dizzy. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I would never target a military officer. My father was Army. I have nothing but respect for the service." General Wells nodded. "I know about your father. Sergeant Frank Mercer, 10th Mountain Division, Purple Heart recipient in Desert Storm." John was surprised. "You looked into my background?" "Of course I did. I wanted to understand who you were before I formed any opinion." The general straightened in his chair. "I'm going to speak at your trial, Officer Mercer. I'm going to tell the judge and jury that I don't believe you intended to harm me, that I believe your actions were the result of untreated trauma." Hope flickered in John's chest for the first time in months. "That would mean everything, sir. But why would you do this for me?" General Wells was quiet for a moment. "Because justice matters. because I've seen too many good people broken by their service, military or civilian, and then abandoned by the very systems they served. He stood up. And because I believe in second chances. After the general left, John was taken back to his cell. That night, he slept better than he had in months. The next morning, Gary arrived with both good news and bad news. General Wells contacted me. He's officially going to testify as a character witness for you at the trial. That's huge. And the bad news? John asked. Gary sighed. The prosecution has added a new witness. Officer Pete Daniels, your former colleague. He's claiming you told him you had a score to settle with the military establishment a week before the funeral. This directly contradicts your PTSD defense. John slammed his fist on the table. That's a complete lie. I never said anything like that. Pete knows I respect the military. My father. I know, Gary said, cutting him off. But it's your word against his, and right now, your word doesn't carry much weight. We need to find someone who can counter his testimony. As the trial date approached, Susan worked tirelessly to help John's case. She collected letters from John's former colleagues who could vouch for his character. She found old photos of John at Veterans Day parades with his father. Most importantly, she tracked down Officer Randy Martinez, who had worked with both John and Pete. Pete came to me a month ago, Randy told Susan over coffee. He said the district attorney promised to fast-track his application to the FBI if he could provide something useful against John. Pete was desperate. His wife is pregnant with twins, and he's been trying to get into the FBI for years. Susan recorded this conversation and gave it to Gary. It wasn't enough to discredit Pete's testimony completely, but it raised questions about his motives. The trial began in January, 11 months after the funeral incident. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters, some supporting John, others demanding the maximum sentence. The national media covered every detail. The case had become a symbol in a larger cultural battle about police accountability, mental health, and respect for the military. Inside the courtroom, District Attorney Vincent Clark presented a powerful, opening argument. This case is about a man who abused his position of trust to threaten a decorated military leader, he told the jury. The evidence will show that John Mercer's actions were deliberate and politically motivated. Gary followed with an equally passionate defense. This case is about a dedicated police officer who was failed by the system he served. John Mercer's actions that day were not the result of hatred or political views. They were the tragic consequence of untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition he developed while protecting his community. The prosecution presented their case first. They showed the video of the incident, which looked damning without context. They presented John's old social media posts, carefully selected to suggest anti-military views. Officer Pete Daniels testified about the score to settle comment, his face solemn as he claimed to be reluctantly betraying a former friend in the interest of truth. When it was the defense's turn, Gary started with expert witnesses who explained PTSD in detail. Dr. Laura Winters used brain scans to show how trauma physically alters the brain, affecting how people perceive threats. She explained how John's experience at the convenience store created a template for danger in his mind that was triggered by General Wells's movement. In that moment, Dr. Winters testified, Officer Mercer wasn't seeing General Wells. His brain was showing him the armed robber from his previous trauma. He was responding to a threat that existed only in his mind. On the fourth day of the trial, General Howard Wells took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he was sworn in. The general, in full dress uniform with rows of medals across his chest, spoke clearly and confidently. I've spent 40 years in service to this country, he began. I've led men and women in combat. I've seen the toll that takes, even on the strongest among us. What happened at that funeral was unfortunate, but I do not believe for one moment that Officer Mercer intended to harm me. The district attorney tried to shake the general's testimony during cross-examination. General Wells, with all due respect to your service, you can't possibly know what was in the defendant's mind that day, Clark said. No, I cannot, the general replied calmly. But I can recognize a fellow warrior suffering from battle scars. Officer Mercer's eyes that day were not the eyes of a would-be assassin. They were the eyes of a man caught in a waking nightmare. I've seen those eyes before, Mr. Clark. Many times. The general's testimony was powerful, but the prosecution's case had been building for months in the media. The jury had heard Officer Pete's lies about John wanting to settle a score. They had seen John's social media posts taken out of context. And most damaging of all, they had watched the video of John pointing his gun at a respected military leader during a solemn funeral. After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. John, Susan, and Gary waited anxiously as the hours turned into days. On the third day of deliberations, the jury sent a note to the judge asking to review General Wells' testimony again. Gary saw this as a positive sign. "They're taking his testimony seriously," he told John during a brief meeting. "That's good for us." On the fourth day, the jury reached their verdict. John stood on shaky legs as the foreman handed a piece of paper to the judge. The courtroom was completely silent. "On the count of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty," the foreman read. "On the count of aggravated assault on a military officer, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of terrorism, we find the defendant not guilty." John heard Susan's sharp intake of breath behind him. The room spun around him. Guilty. Despite General Wells's testimony, despite the expert witnesses explaining his PTSD, despite everything, they had found him guilty. Gary placed a steadying hand on John's arm. "This isn't over," he whispered. "We'll appeal." But as John looked at the stern faces of the jurors, he knew the worst was yet to come. In 2 weeks, he would return to this courtroom for sentencing, and based on the charges he'd been convicted of, he could be facing decades in prison, possibly even life. As the guards led him away, John caught a glimpse of General Wells in the gallery. The older man's face was grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. Their eyes met briefly, and the general gave John a small nod. In that moment, John realized that while he might have lost this battle, the general wasn't done fighting for him. The 2 weeks between the verdict and sentencing were the hardest of John's life. He sat in his cell, replaying the trial in his mind, wondering what more could have been done. Susan visited every day, trying to stay positive, but John could see the fear in her eyes. Their savings were gone, spent on legal fees. Their son Billy had stopped going to school because of bullying. Their daughter Katie had dropped out of college to move back home and support her mother. On the morning of the sentencing, John put on the suit Gary had brought him. It hung loose on his frame. He had lost 30 pounds since his arrest. The courthouse was even more crowded than during the trial. News vans lined the street. John caught glimpses of signs held by protesters as he was led inside. Some read, "Justice for Mercer," while others demanded, "Maximum sentence." Inside the courtroom, John saw Susan and the kids in the front row. Behind them sat several of John's former police colleagues who had remained loyal. On the other side of the aisle, John was surprised to see General Wells sitting with several high-ranking military officers. Judge Harriet Powell entered, and everyone stood. She had a reputation for harsh sentences, and her face gave no hint of mercy as she looked down at John. "Before I pronounce sentence, does the defendant wish to make a statement?" she asked. John stood slowly. He had practiced what to say many times in his cell, but now the carefully planned words left him. He looked at his family, then at the judge. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said, his voice cracking. "What happened that day was terrible, and I take responsibility for it. But it wasn't hatred or politics that made me draw my weapon. It was a mind broken by trauma that I didn't understand and tried to hide." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've lost everything already. My career, my reputation, my freedom. My family has suffered because of my mistake. I ask for mercy, not for myself, but for them." John sat down. The judge's expression hadn't changed. "Does the victim wish to make a statement?" Judge Powell asked, looking at General Wells. The general stood, impressive in his full-dress uniform. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." He walked to the front of the courtroom, standing directly in front of the judge. "I was the person Officer Mercer pointed his weapon at that day. Under the law, I am considered the victim in this case. And as the victim, I am asking for leniency." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge frowned. "Officer Mercer's actions were wrong," the general continued. "But they were not malicious. They were the actions of a man suffering from the same condition that affects thousands of our military personnel: post-traumatic stress disorder. We, in the military, recognize this condition. We treat it. We don't punish people for having it." The general turned to look directly at John. "This man deserves treatment, not a lifetime in prison. That would be an injustice to a dedicated officer who served his community for 15 years. When General Wells returned to his seat, District Attorney Vincent Clark approached the bench. His ambition was well known. There were rumors he planned to run for State Attorney General next year, and this high-profile case could boost his career. "Your Honor," Clark said, "while we respect General Wells's perspective, the jury has found the defendant guilty of very serious crimes. The state recommends the maximum sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. This will send a clear message that attacks on military personnel will not be tolerated in our state." Gary jumped up. "Your Honor, that is completely disproportionate. Cases with similar circumstances typically result in sentences of 5 to 7 years. The prosecution is asking for life because this case has political significance, not because justice demands it." Judge Powell silenced them both with a wave of her hand. She looked down at the papers in front of her for a long moment. The courtroom was completely silent. "John Mercer," she finally said, "you have been found guilty of attempted murder and aggravated assault on a military officer. These are extremely serious offenses that undermine public safety and respect for our military. While I acknowledge your service record and the testimony regarding your mental health, I cannot ignore the gravity of your actions." She paused, looking directly at John. "It is the sentence of this court that you be confined to the state penitentiary for a term of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years. Susan cried out. Katie put her arms around her mother. Billy stared straight ahead, his young face hard with anger. John felt numb, as if he were watching this happen to someone else. "This court is adjourned," Judge Powell said, striking her gavel. Guards approached to take John away. He turned to look at his family one last time. Susan was sobbing, her face buried in Katie's shoulder. Billy met his father's eyes, then turned and walked out of the courtroom. As John was led away, he passed General Wells. The general looked shocked by the sentence. "I'm sorry," John said quietly as he passed. "Thank you for trying." The general reached out and gripped John's arm briefly. "This isn't over, son." 3 days later, John was transferred to Northern State Penitentiary, a maximum security facility 5 hours from Oakland. The prison was a maze of concrete and steel, housing 2,000 of the state's most dangerous criminals. As a former police officer, John was placed in protective custody, isolated from the general population who would target him for his former profession. His cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a metal bed, a small desk, a toilet, and a sink. Through the narrow window, he could see the exercise yard where he would be allowed to walk alone for 1 hour each day. This would be his home for the next 25 years, if he was lucky enough to get parole on his first try. The reality of his situation hit him that first night. He was 42 years old. If he served his minimum sentence, he would be 67 when he got out. His children would be middle-aged. His career was over. His marriage might not survive the separation. This was his life now. John fell into a deep depression. He barely ate. He didn't speak during Susan's weekly visits. He went through the prison routines like a robot. The prison psychiatrist prescribed medication for his PTSD and depression, but John often flushed the pills down the toilet. What was the point of getting better when he had nothing to live for? 6 months into his sentence, something unexpected happened. Gary visited with news. "General Wells has been busy," Gary said. "He started an organization called Justice for Mercer. They're raising awareness about PTSD in police officers and working to change how the system deals with it. The general has been giving speeches all over the country." John shrugged. That's good for other officers, I guess. Doesn't help me much. Gary leaned forward. That's not all. The general has also hired a team of investigators to look into your case. They're digging into District Attorney Clark's communications, looking for evidence of misconduct. If they find something, we could have grounds for an appeal. For the first time in months, John felt a flicker of interest. Do they have anything? Yet? Nothing solid. But they're not giving up. Gary hesitated. There's something else. Susan wanted me to tell you. She's started a support group for families of officers with PTSD. It's already helping a lot of people. John felt a pang of pride mixed with sadness. Susan had always been strong. She was finding a way to create meaning from their tragedy. Tell her I'm proud of her, John said. After Gary left, John returned to his cell. That night, for the first time since his sentencing, he took his medication. He lay on his narrow bed, thinking about what Gary had said. General Wells hadn't given up on him. Susan hadn't given up on him. Maybe, John thought as he drifted off to sleep, he shouldn't give up on himself either. The next morning, John went to the prison library and checked out a book on meditation techniques for PTSD. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A small act of hope in a place designed to crush it. He didn't know if he would ever get out of prison, but he knew he couldn't spend the next 25 years as a hollow shell of himself. Outside the prison walls, unknown to John, forces were gathering that would eventually change the course of his case. A young investigative journalist named Lisa Parker had started looking into District Attorney Vincent Clark's handling of high-profile cases. General Wells was meeting with state senators about reforming sentencing guidelines for cases involving mental health. And Susan Mercer was becoming a powerful voice for police reform and mental health awareness. The fight for John's freedom was just beginning. 3 years passed inside Northern State Penitentiary. John marked the time with small scratches on the wall beside his bed. 1,095 lines. 3 years of his life gone. 22 more to go before he could hope for parole. John had changed during this time. His hair had thinned and turned gray at the temples. Lines etched his face. But there were other changes too. He exercised daily in his cell, doing push-ups and sit-ups until his muscles burned. He read books from the prison library, history, psychology, law. He attended weekly therapy sessions and took his medication regularly. The hollow shell was filling up again, slowly. Susan visited every other weekend, making the 5-hour drive. Faithfully. Their children came less often. Katie had returned to college and was now in her final year of nursing school. Billy had just started community college. They were building lives that increasingly had no place for a father behind bars. On a cold Saturday in November, Susan arrived for her regular visit looking different. Her eyes were bright with excitement, and she could barely sit still as they took their seats in the visiting room. Lisa Parker from the Bay Area Times contacted me yesterday, Susan said, keeping her voice low. She's been investigating District Attorney Clark for the past year. John leaned forward. Lisa Parker was an award-winning investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. What did she want? She's found something, John. Emails between Clark and Judge Powell before your sentencing. Apparently they discussed your case privately, which is completely illegal. Powell was up for reappointment and needed the governor's support. Clark promised to put in a good word if she gave you the maximum sentence. John's heart raced. That's judicial misconduct. That could be grounds for a new trial. Susan nodded, eagerly. Gary is already preparing the appeal. The article comes out tomorrow. It's not just about your case. Clark has done this with other high-profile cases too. Hope was dangerous in prison. John had learned to live without it, but now it flooded back, making his hands shake. Even if we get a new trial, that doesn't mean I'll be found innocent. There's more, Susan said. Officer Pete Daniels was arrested last week for taking bribes. During questioning, he admitted to lying on the stand in your case. He said Clark promised to help his FBI application if he testified that you said you had a score to settle with the military. John sat back, stunned. He confessed to perjury? Yes. And General Wells is still fighting for you. His organization has grown. They're pushing for a bill in the state legislature to reform how cases involving PTSD are handled. Susan reached across the table and squeezed John's hand. It's happening, John. Things are finally moving. The next day, Lisa Parker's article appeared on the front page of the Bay Area Times. Justice for Sale, D.A. Clark's Corrupt Bargains. The story detailed how Clark had manipulated judges and witnesses in multiple high-profile cases to secure harsh sentences that would boost his political career. John's case featured prominently with quotes from General Wells, expert testimony from Dr. Winters, and the revelation of Pete Daniels' perjury. The article caused an immediate uproar. News channels picked up the story. The State Bar Association opened an investigation into Clark. Judge Powell announced her early retirement, and most importantly for John, the State Court of Appeals agreed to hear his case on an expedited basis. Gary called with the news. We go before the appeals court in 30 days. Given the evidence of judicial misconduct and witness perjury, we have a strong case for overturning your conviction. John had learned to be cautious with hope. Even if they overturn it, the state could still retry me. They could, Gary agreed. But Clark has been suspended pending investigation. The new acting DA is more reasonable, and public opinion has shifted dramatically in your favor since Parker's article. The appeals hearing was held in the state capitol. John was transported there in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. The courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters, wearing Justice for Mercer t-shirts, and curious onlookers. Susan sat in the front row with Katie and Billy, all three holding hands. The three-judge panel listened as Gary presented evidence of the misconduct that had tainted John's original trial. He played audio recordings of Pete Daniels admitting to his perjury. He showed the emails between Clark and Judge Powell discussing John's sentencing before it happened. He entered into evidence statements from 3 jurors who said they would have voted differently if they had known about the misconduct. The state's attorney made only a half-hearted defense, acknowledging the serious problems with the original trial, but arguing that John should be retried rather than simply released. After 2 days of arguments, the judges announced they would issue their ruling within a week. John returned to prison to wait, trying not to count the hours. 6 days later, Gary arrived at the prison with a wide smile on his face. They overturned your conviction, he said as soon as they sat down in the meeting room. All charges. The appeals court ruled that the misconduct was so severe that a fair retrial would be impossible. John stared at him. What does that mean? It means you're going home, John. Today. The paperwork is being processed right now. John couldn't speak. The walls of the prison, which had defined his world for 3 years, suddenly seemed insubstantial, like they might dissolve around him. There's a crowd outside, Gary continued. Reporters, supporters, General Wells is there. And Susan, of course, with the kids. 3 hours later, John walked through the prison gates wearing civilian clothes for the first time in 3 years. The bright sunlight hurt his eyes. The air smelled different, fresher, wider somehow. Susan ran to him, wrapping her arms around him so tightly he could barely breathe. Katie and Billy joined the embrace, and for a long moment the family clung to each other, oblivious to the cameras and shouted questions. When they finally separated, John found himself face to face with General Howard Wells. The older man had aged since John last saw him, but his posture was still military straight, his handshake firm. Welcome back, Officer Mercer, the general said. I'm not an officer anymore, John replied. Perhaps not. But you're still a man who served with honor. That was never in doubt. In the days that followed, John struggled to adjust to freedom. The world had changed in 3 years. Technology had advanced. Old stores had closed. New ones had opened. Friends had moved away. His parents' house had been sold after his father died during John's 2nd year in prison. Most difficult was the constant attention. News outlets wanted interviews. People recognized him on the street. Some were supportive, others hostile. The story of the cop who pointed a gun at a general and spent 3 years in prison before being exonerated was too dramatic to ignore. Susan suggested they move away from Oakland, start fresh somewhere new. But John resisted. Running away won't solve anything. I need to rebuild here, where it all happened. 2 weeks after his release, John received a call from an unexpected source. The new police chief of Oakland, Maria Gonzalez, wanted to meet with him. Curious, John agreed. Chief Gonzalez was in her 50s with short salt and pepper hair and direct eyes. She got straight to the point. Mr. Mercer, the department failed you. We should have recognized your PTSD symptoms. We should have provided better support. What happened to you was a tragedy that could have been prevented. John nodded, uncertain where this was going. I'm creating a new unit, she continued. A mental health response team, made up of officers and professional counselors. They'll respond to situations involving mental health crises, and they'll also provide support for our own officers who are struggling. I'd like you to be part of it. John was stunned. You want me back on the force? Not as a patrol officer, as a consultant initially. Your experience, both as an officer with PTSD and as someone who has seen the worst of the justice system, makes you uniquely qualified. You could help prevent other officers from going through what you did. It wasn't a return to his old life, that was gone forever. But it was a chance to create meaning from his suffering, to turn his nightmare into something that might help others. John thought about it for only a moment before saying yes. 6 months later, John stood before a room full of police cadets. Behind him was a PowerPoint slide with the title, Recognizing PTSD in Yourself and Fellow Officers. My name is John Mercer, he began. 5 years ago, I pointed a gun at a military general during a funeral because my mind was trapped in a flashback. I spent 3 years in prison before evidence of misconduct in my case came to light. I'm here to tell you my story so that you don't repeat my mistakes. As he spoke, John saw General Wells slip quietly into the back of the room, nodding encouragement. The general had become a friend and mentor during John's adjustment to freedom. Together with Susan, they had turned the Justice for Mercer organization into a national advocacy group for criminal justice and mental health reform. The path ahead would not be easy. John still had nightmares, now about prison as well as the convenience store shooting. His relationship with his children remained strained. The lawsuit against the state for wrongful imprisonment would drag on for years. But for the first time since that terrible day at the funeral, John felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Not a victim, not a cautionary tale, but a man with purpose.